Hello team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war. It is a live news update. I'm going to be doing my geopolitics news with you today live because I have so much stuff to talk about, and sometimes it's just easier to throw this out as a live. I may even spill it over. I've got a little bit of military aid news that I could throw in as well. Might see how it goes for time. I have a massive amount of US political news, which I'll do as a separate video, as a pre-recorded video, but I might dip into some of that as well, because it seems very obvious at the moment that a lot of what's going on internationally, geopolitically, concerning, as I often say, I think the war in Ukraine is at the heart of global geopolitics. And it's like the center of this intricate spider's web that affects most every nation in the world. And I think that we can trace everything to Ukraine, but you could probably choose any other global event and put that at the center of the spider's web, and you'll have the same sort of situation where Ukraine will be out here. I've placed Ukraine in the center, and we can connect things from Ukraine. And so it seems very obvious at the moment that so much of what's going on with Ukraine really centers around what's going on in the United States. And the United States is going through a bit of an identity crisis at the moment. And I think they are, the administration at the moment there, Trump and Musk, are taking the US and reversing history in a sense, and taking the country, or seemingly wanting to take the country in a completely new direction. And that new direction is to eschew all the old connections and allies and influence operations that they are invested in globally, using entities like USAID, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty, and all of that, and also the CIA, FBI, counterintelligence, counter-terrorism, etc., etc., etc. All of these entities that have helped the US to project its power in the world, they are defunding, stopping, reversing, and changing the direction of the US, while still trying to say America first, and still wanting America to be at the forefront of the world, like economically and politically, but getting rid of the institutions that would enable them to continue to be at the top. I'm not saying you shouldn't reform things at all, that the American government couldn't make cuts, couldn't have reforms, but the way they're doing it at the moment appears to be benefiting China and Russia in everything they do, whilst at the same time, putting a few tariffs on China, but then actually ramping up tariffs now on everyone else, including on the EU. Now, I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be some equalization of tariffs with the rest of the world, but what needs to be understood, and I think Joe Bloggs does a good job of talking about that in his video today, I think what needs to be understood is that if there's a trade deficit, anything that you do to try and equalize that deficit, which you might, Trump says, oh, we've got a trade deficit with Canada or this nation, that nation. Okay, so we are buying more of their stuff than they are buying of ours. But if we want to kind of equalize that, then that will cause at least short-term pain. And everything that America will be doing, or the US will be trying to do at the moment, will be inflationary. And he needs to communicate that. Trump needs to communicate that very, very openly, I think, with his electorate. And I don't think he's doing that. And I just think there are champagne corks popping in Beijing and in Moscow at the moment, because literally everything that Trump is doing and Musk is doing is to the benefit of Russia and China. And this is at a moment where Russia are on their knees, China are in trouble as well, economically and demographically. And the US has this opportunity to take advantage of that positioning, the relative weakness of those two countries. And they've got a chance of turning the screw, keeping the foot very firmly planted on Russia's economic neck. And yet everything they are doing is going against that. And it's just really, really disturbing. we might have Jonathan Fink joining us, actually, because I sent out a link to him. So I'll be very interested in his views on this. And I know what I don't want to do, and when I'm attacking Donald Trump or attacking the US administration, please don't think I'm anti-American. I'm not. Whenever I attack America, I'm attacking or any other nation on earth, like Russia. Like I'm careful, and I was talking about this in my video, my hits and losses video this morning, where I'm very reticent to tar an entire nation with a brush, right? It's very simplistic, and I don't think it's helpful at all. Although I think it's interesting that there are some cultural differences between Russia and Ukraine that I think we can start to say, okay, Russians are more likely to do this, so we can say that Russians are like this to a degree. But when I'm criticizing the United States, what I'm doing is criticizing characteristics of their administration. And so I know that many of my viewers are American, and many of them will be classic Republicans. What I don't have a problem doing is criticizing large aspects of MAGA politics in America, which I think is populist and simplistic, and seeks to try and solve very complex problems with simplistic answers. And so yeah, so please don't think that I'm being anti-American. I'm being anti-democratic and anti-corruption and anti-transparency, if you like. So let's go back to this idea of, and we'll talk about the United States here, but let's talk about every nation or entity. So this is the same with the EU. So when we're looking at what some of the decisions the EU are at the moment, let's treat it exactly the same as we are with what the US is trying to do. So we've got two pots. Those two pots, as I keep saying, like, is this in the pot that is pro-transparency, pro-democracy, pro-freedom, getting rid of kleptocracy and corruption, in a sense, anti-kleptocracy and anti-corruption, so on and so forth. Is this fair? So you've got that bucket, and then the other bucket is all the opposite to that. So is this about obfuscation and closing down transparency and corruption, and is this pro-Russia? Is this pro-autocracy? Which bucket do we put it in? And then actually you can have another scenario where, like, okay, is this to the benefit of Russia and China or not to the benefit of Russia and China? So when you're looking at each and every action that the EU is taking, that the UK is taking, that France is taking, that Japan is taking, that the US is taking, do we put those that action in a pro-China and Russia bucket or an anti-China and anti-Russia bucket? And that's very simplistic, I know, but that's how I think we need to treat this stuff. So that's how I'm going to look at today's news, and Jonathan Fink will be joining us. But let's start at the moment as I move my own my noggin over there. And Jonathan is here. So before I do that, let's get Mr. Fink in the action. Jonathan, very good to see you. It's been so long.
It is great to see you. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Is that coming through?
Loud and clear.
Fantastic.
With beautiful clarity. So I just started off this conversation because I was explaining to the audience, I don't want to seem anti-American. I'm anti-democracy at the moment. And when we're looking at global geopolitical news, we need to try and think whether whatever action taken by whatever country we're talking about is pro-democracy or anti-democracy. It's almost like we've got two very simplistic pots to put that action in. Is this pro-corruption or anti-corruption? Pro-transparency, anti-transparency, whatever. So you got these two kind of pots, and that action seems to be either in that pot or that pot. I'm being very binary here. And also, is it pro-China or anti-China, pro-Russia or anti-Russia? And so when we're looking at everything that we're going to talk about today, who do these things benefit? So if I'm being critical of what the US is doing at the moment, it's not because it's the US, it's because the administration appears to be falling into one of these categories, and I'm being anti-administration rather than anti-American.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there's a lot of people who, whereas they may not call themselves MAGA, would still identify as sort of GOP or Republican or conservative with a small c in the US. And a lot of their rhetoric, a lot of their actual identity features around the idea that actually they're still on board with maximizing freedom, that actually freedom is the thing you want to increase in the world, and disfreedom is the thing you want to diminish. But what's really weird about what's happening in the last couple of years is we see America sliding into what I would see as a far more oligarchic style of governance. And those moneyed sources, those oligarchic influences, are able to weaponize traditional media to protect their interests and actually to increase their wealth control over society. And actually, many of those oligarchs are supported by those who champion freedom. The destructive processes we see, the bull in the china shop approach that we see with USAID, and now they're turning their sights on radio liberty and these kind of things. There's a lot more American institutions that are going to get smashed into pieces. And there are people who are saying, well, this is great because this enhances freedom. This is giving power back to the people, blah, blah, blah. So we got a complex set of narratives going on. And if we just scream, Trump bad, I suspect we're missing out on some of the sort of nuances. We're missing out on some people who further down the line might be potential allies of us in this fight.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is because, you know, by being robustly critical of the US, and I'm actually going to take that even further in a little while, we might be burning bridges that could be very useful later on, as you say, and that's problematic. But then you also need to be dealing with issues here up front, and we'll get onto that in a second as we go through some of the news items that I have to talk about. So let's start. We're not actually going to start with the US, I don't think. Let me get my my tabs, my 8 gazillion tabs up here for us to discuss. We're actually going to start first of all with Transnistria, and this is the EU. So again, you know, what is the EU trying to do? What is the goal of the EU? I was listening to Ursula von der Leyen the other day, who was talking about the goals when she's speaking to EU ambassadors with this new mandate. It's about the prosperity and security of the EU nations and citizens, and so everything that they do is looking at, it's not just about sort of raw transactional power, although if it is, then that is because it feeds into prosperity and security for the nations of the EU and their citizens. Transnistria, so they have Transnistria's had their hydrocarbons turned off, supplied from Russia. And the EU has come along and said, look, we will help you out. Here's 60 million euros of aid that we're prepared to put into Transnistria, that annexed area to the east of Moldova. But Russia is not allowing them to accept European aid for fear of losing control over the region. It's that game of chess that's going on here. The main condition for granting the grant was a gradual increase in consumer tariffs. Tiraspol refused. So the Moldovan Prime Minister added that Moldova would not leave the region without gas. The gas supply will be provided by a company from Hungary, whose services will be paid for by a company registered in the UAE. Oh my goodness, what a strangled path we see there. But it's interesting that you know, the EU are providing assistance or offering to provide assistance, and Transnistria are like, no, because we don't want to piss off our imperial overmasters there. So yeah,
it's a weird one, isn't it? It's a real contortion trying to make that work, but to what end? I think, you know, unless we sort of move in wholesale and boot the Russians out, all of this is a form of tinkering almost, not accepting the real elephant in the room, and that is that this is one of those territories which Moscow has co-opted and controlled and uses a little puppet enclave to try and destabilize Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we go on, and again, like everything, it's just everything is about this game of chess that's going on, and the EU, like, is I talked recently about Guy Verhofstadt, the ex-Belgian prime minister, who is now very involved in the EU, talking about this new age of empires, and like the EU needs to think of itself as an empire because it's having to compete against this Chinese empire, the American empire. You've got Britain there. Britain's trying to work out its identity in this new world, and obviously Russia as well. And you're seeing all of these kings and queens of the world being moved into position in this kind of four-way game of chess. Xi Jinping will visit Moscow on May the 9th, and has also invited Putin to China for the anniversary of the victory over Japan. That's an interesting sort of dynamic there. Other leaders expected to attend include Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico, Serbian President Vučić, and Brazilian leader Lula da Silva. And again, fascinating. How's the EU going to respond to this? How's the US going to respond to this? Meanwhile, the EU plans to add 25 more Chinese entities to sanctions lists for circumventing sanctions against Russia. That's something the EU is doing, but the US doesn't seem to be doing. Is the US going soft on China? Although China are reacting to the US's tariffs on China that were kind of all part of that Canada and Mexico set of tariffs, but then Trump blinked with those two nations but left the Chinese ones in place, and now that could be biting the US on the arse. With a trade war looming, Chinese companies accused of transferring European-made goods to buyers linked to the Russian military who are denied access to them. So the EU being strong on China there. And then, and just before I get your reaction to all of this, Europe is planning to seize Russia's shadow fleet. I think this is super important. After a spate of sabotage incidents, talks are now underway to use legal, environmental, and piracy laws to crack down on tankers dodging sanctions and fueling Moscow's war. Challenges remain, momentum is growing. So we are seeing the EU being stronger on China and Russia, and the US has yet to have done a single sanction or a single thing against Russia since Trump took power on January the 20th. And I think this is telling you, I think what we're seeing here is Europe starting to step up, the US starting to recede, and I think eventually this will become Europe's war with Russia, and the US will play a very small part.
Well, China's curious, isn't it? Because I've done quite a few episodes over the last 3 years, just looking at, well, what is China's long game here? I mean, it strikes me that Russia, it's the guy in the pub who wants to be a bit of a hard man, but perhaps, doesn't necessarily, want all of that attention on themselves. They bring a big scary dog with them, foaming at the mouth, and that's almost an extension of their aggression. It seems to me that Russia is the foaming, crazy dog that you sort of, bring to the party as an extension of your, your willingness to try and exert some kind of terror over people. Russia plays that role for China quite admirably, and yet we fail to see that link of how China uses it. I'm not sure China. They don't want Russia to lose. They don't want Russia to collapse. They don't necessarily want Russia to be successful. They don't want it to be a fully independent entity in its own right, or one of these big players, one of these big blocks on the global stage. And I think they're quite happy to let Russia become subservient to China and to move into the orbit of that power block that's shaping up. I mean, do you think that's looking at China in too cynical a fashion, or are they playing some kind of long-term, rather insidious authoritarian chess here?
Well, I think there's all sorts of games of chess going on, but I think it's quite interesting. There's quite a lot of talk at the moment about, partly because the US has been less than amicable towards the EU since Trump has taken power, that there are some saying that the EU might start turning towards China. And if that starts happening, then that's a fascinating thing, because the EU is also very wary of China. China's got its Belt and Road Initiative, which is kind of a US aid form of, but even more kind of potent and more tangible, where they're doing an awful lot of funding, including that railway from Serbia through to Budapest, I think it is. They've got police on the streets of Hungary, the Chinese. China is trying to infiltrate the EU from the east. And so, but still some are saying, well, actually, this could be an opportunity for the EU to get much closer to China. in which case that changes the dynamics of global geopolitics hugely. And this could be, those, you've got those Republican hawks in the US that before the election were sounding all these alarm bells about China, saying actually we shouldn't be some of them were saying we shouldn't be concentrating on Ukraine, we should be concentrating on China and Taiwan. Trump has come in and said, actually, I think we should sanction Taiwan because we should be making our own electronics and microchips, etc., etc. And you have had a bit of a reversal on China. Well, if the EU starts getting close to China, then that all goodness knows there's so many variables going on and so many different moves going on in the world that I just don't know what there seems to be a lack of clarity about what the US's objectives are at the moment, because Trump seems to be so prima facie transactional, really like obviously transactional with really super tangible close things. He's not playing a long game. I don't think Trump has the capability of playing a long game. So you've got rare earth metals featuring in the US's calculations as to what should happen with Ukraine, rather than thinking about what the world will look like in 50 years time, which is what the US has been traditionally doing in terms of US aid and the Cold War and all of these machinations. Now it seems like, well, are we going to make 10 quid off some rare earth metals? Then we'll do that. And so I don't know. I don't know if I answered your question, but I've got so much going on in my brain at the moment. Nice bit of silence there.
I lost the screen there when you got so many screens open, like you when you're researching, news stories, and you have 1,000 tabs open, then you're like, I can't find the tab. I think this is the interesting about China. It's opaque. It's very difficult to know what's going on. It's very difficult to actually get any information out of the regime. One could say that's the same with Russia. We don't know what conversations being had in the inner circle of Putin, his advisors, if indeed he has that many close advisors and associates anymore. These are kind of a black box, which we can only conjecture about. But I suspect that Russia is far more, I would say, transactional. It's far more reactive than we give it credit for. In that respect, Russia is something we can sort of puzzle out, and that's a process we're doing this over the last couple of years. China, however, is far less scrutable, as it were. But what do you make of this story that was breaking just as we were leaving Ukraine, that China is building a version of the Pentagon outside Beijing? It's just 10 times larger than that huge sort of military planning complex in Washington.
So I think China plays the long game better. And I think I talked about this previously, and I may have mentioned it with you, Jonathan, talking about the advantage of having a Chinese dictatorship is that, from China's point of view, is that they don't exist on 4-year, 5-year election cycles. And because they don't exist in those cycles, they can do long-term planning so much better. So China can say, right, we're going to put in this expenditure, we're going to be involved in this Belt and Road Initiative, and this is like a 25-year game we're playing here. And we can afford to do that because me, as Xi Jinping, I'm going to rule until I die, type thing. And so therefore I can do long-term strategic planning in a way that other countries can't. Like in the UK at the moment, it's a 4 to 5 year election cycle where the Labour Party is thinking, right, okay, we've got a bit of safety now for about 2 years, and then we've really got to be into campaign mode. And so there's no point doing these big projects that are going to be like 10, 20-year projects, because that's not going to get us re-elected. So we can't say, oh, we're spending billions of pounds now for something that's going to come to fruition in 20 years. But China can do that. So China can play the long game in a way that democratic nations can't. And they do it in a much better way than I think Russia. Russia plays a long game in terms of disrupting other people, in terms of disinformation campaigns. But I don't think Russia have done a very good job of sorting out their own citizens and playing a long game and putting Russia in a stable situation. If you look to the regions of Russia that are very poor and they're lacking in infrastructure. So I think, as you say, Russia are probably both reactive and disruptive. China are probably that as well, but have a really big sense of where they want China to be and looking after their population, the food security. That's why they're going around the world hoovering up agricultural land around the world, because they're worried about food security for their population. And I think you know, the US has taken their eye off the game, and you know they were strong on China prior to the election, and now the elections come along, and I think Trump has moved his target from China to easy wins like Canada, Mexico, and the EU. So he can establish power over his allies rather than try and wrest power away from China.
Absolutely, absolutely, and still a lot of this rests on what happens in Ukraine, and I think it's quite clear that China does not want a full Ukrainian victory. It may be ambiguous about whether it wants to see Ukraine defeated or not. But I think in that respect, Chinese policy is very similar to what one could characterize Biden's policy as. You know, we don't want to see a catastrophic failure of either of the participants. It may be in China's interest that the long attritional war is not just an attritional war between Russia and Ukraine, but actually is an attritional war between Russia and the West. Seeing the West attrited, seeing the West weaknesses, the slowness of democratic process, the almost lethargy of our populations in waking up to the threat of Russia. This is all useful information for China to see our ability to resist, our willingness to resist, as Ukrainians call it, voля, which has been distinctly lacking. And actually which parts of our military industrial complex can retool faster and which ones can't. This is all incredibly strategically useful information for China that they've been learning over the last 3 years.
Absolutely. And just talking about Russia, well, let's go back to hydrocarbons. There is an opinion piece in Kyiv Independent by Svetlana Romanko. Europe must act on Russian LNG before Trump makes it impossible. Europe must ban Russian LNG now before Trump turns sanctions into a bargaining chip. Now, we have seen a surge in European demand for hydrocarbons, well, for some hydrocarbons, as they are, you know, doing a good job in weaning off dependency on Russia in some areas, but not in others. Some may argue that banning Russian LNG, this article says, now is futile if it could later be reversed in a peace deal. This view overlooks two key points. First, implementing a ban now would significantly strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position. Second, banning Russian LNG would accelerate energy diversification across Europe, establishing new trade patterns that would be difficult and unwise to undo, even in the event of a future agreement. The Trump administration is likely to pressure Europe to adopt its own sanctions policy, even at the expense of European interests. The US has a history of urging the EU to dilute its measures, as seen with the oil price cap, which replaced the EU's original plan for a full ban on Russian oil trade. By taking decisive action now, Europe can assert its autonomy and safeguard its long-term financial and strategic interests. By banning Russian LNG imports, potentially as part of an upcoming 16th sanctions package, the EU would send a strong message of unity and resolve to Moscow. To ensure a smooth transition, Ukrainian civil society encourages the European Commission to establish a fund to support member states and industries in moving away from gas and to strengthen energy partnerships with Ukraine, particularly in renewable energy development and grid interconnection. The EU has taken a measured long-term approach to phasing out Russian fossil fuels, carefully securing consensus and imposing bans incrementally. But the return of chaos agent Donald Trump forces the European Commission to make a critical decision. It can continue enabling Russia's war machine through LNG imports, or it can take bold action to sever the toxic lifeline once and for all. So that's an opinion there. And talking about further sanctions, the EU vows retaliatory measures as Trump sets to announce 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium. The European Commission promised to, quote, react to protect the interests of European businesses, workers and consumers from unjustified measures, with France demanding that the European Commission immediately impose tariffs on US goods in response to Trump's new restrictions. So there is this sense of a growing trade war between the US and the EU, while at the same time the EU is maybe considering banning Russian imports once and for all in terms of LNG, but then probably having to go to the US to try and replace that LNG through other sources.
It's complicated, isn't it? And in this sense, from the Ukrainian perspective, it could be that Trump is more advantageous than Biden was. Actually, Biden had started to really close some of the loopholes and put pressure on Russian hydrocarbon trading, including the shadow fleet. That had started to ramp up in the final days and weeks of Biden's presidency. It is, I think, to the eternal shame of Europe and America that this didn't happen far sooner, closer to the full-scale war and close to the point where Ukraine was in the ascendancy, when it retook Kiev and then later Kherson. We've waited far too long to put this kind of pressure on. But it does seem that Trump, if he's minded to, and there's no guarantee he is, but if he is minded to want Putin to come to the negotiating table, he may well use these levers that he's got, both to pressure Russia, but also to pressure Europe into stopping those sort of trades. At this point, it could go either way, and I think there's a battle for the hearts and minds, or certainly the minds of people in the Trump administration, persuading them that actually they've got far more leverage than they perhaps suspect, and that Russia is far more fragile than the propaganda would have us to believe. So closing these loopholes is going to have, a real material effect on Putin's ability to wage war.
I think really, like, Trump has this opportunity to cement his legacy in global history by being the nail in the coffin of Russia. He really could put an end to Putin's power with regard to what they could do sanctions wise and economically to Russia. US Treasury Department together with the EU, but Trump could take all the plaudits for that, could really hammer Russia. And yet, we see consistently that he's taking the easy option of looking at allies instead. So here we've got, with a stroke of my pen, this is Trump himself saying, he can stop companies from manufacturing cars in Canada, and he says he could stop Canada from being a viable country. That is how he treats America's closest ally. This isn't just bullying, it's economic terrorism. And that's the sort of stuff he's saying on Air Force One there. It's just quite incredible how he doesn't see traditional enemies of Russia and China as enemies anymore. He just is looking at the world entirely transactionally. Russia plans to expand its power to seize Western assets in response to sanctions. Reuters reports, and of course, those are the sanctions from the EU and from the previous American administration. New legislation will allow Moscow to confiscate frozen funds from foreign companies and investors as a countermeasure. My hope here is, as Russia has done a number of times previously, they make stupid decisions. So Russia sometimes attacks people in ways that generate animosity against Russia. And if Russia here were to freeze American assets, then that would give Trump permission to take aim at Russia instead of continuing to take aim at their allies. And finally, just before I let you cast your opinion, Russian officials believe Western pressure is hampering Moscow's efforts to draw ex-Soviet nations closer into its orbits. I think Azerbaijan, think Armenia as particular ones, and of course Georgia, Kazakhstan, differing situations there. But it's struggling to draw these nations closer into its orbit and build economic ties with the global south, according to a leaked government report obtained by the Financial Times' Max Seddon. So Financial Times reporting that Russian officials believe Western pressure is hampering their efforts to gain traction with their geographical allies, close geographical allies.
And it has to be said as well that this isn't new from Russia. Russia has been busy confiscating foreign assets since the start of the full-scale war, and there was plenty of opportunity for us and for the US administration to respond in a harsh fashion before. We haven't taken this opportunity. So something that could really work with Trump is to say, look, you could do something that Biden failed to do. You could deal with Russia harshly based on its outright theft of Western assets that were operating in the country, based on its sort of terroristic attitude towards Western interests. Well, look, Biden failed. You could succeed. Here you go. It's a great PR line that you could use with your base. And I think at this point, it's a toss-up, isn't it? We're not US citizens, so we may be tempted to wade in to the highly partisan left-right bickering and say, Trump's fascist and this is fascism, and use those kind of labels. There are, of course, extremely disquieting features of the Trump regime, and it's it's moving extremely swiftly to dismantle aspects of what have been considered traditional good governance in the US. There are moves to render the concept of even federal law inoperable, and we can come back to those. So there are these troubling things, but with our Ukraine hat on, we have to suggest opportunities. We have to understand and appeal to this transactional nature of Trump, try to get what we want, which is Ukraine to survive, to be victorious, and by extension, Europe to be protected from a revanchist Russian empire that is prepared to open the floodgates to North Korean troops, maybe even later Chinese troops, to incorporate Europe into its power bloc. I mean, this might sound alarmist, but this is where I think the whole thing is heading.
And as I will repeat that Trump has the opportunity to make himself a hero, to create this legacy for himself, where he is responsible for the downfall of Russia. Even though I would argue that actually 3 years of slow walking aid to Ukraine, and I've said this a number of times, so I'll repeat myself. Biden, one of the collateral outcomes for his slow walking of aid to Ukraine has been to fundamentally weaken Russia, to the point where Trump can come along and put that final nail in the coffin and say, this was all me. I don't care if he does that, as long as the right outcome is brought about. And just, one of your viewers here, Jonathan, can't listen to this MS guy slagging off USA again. Thumbs down for me. As I said at the beginning, you may have missed it, Denton. I'm terribly sorry I've upset you. You may have missed it at the beginning. I said I am not doing this to be anti-American. What I'm saying is anti-democracy, or sorry, anti-democracy. So I'm trying to, when I criticize the US, I'm criticizing the US administration for making poor decisions. If you're a fan, Denton, right? So let's just go through this, Denton. Let's just go through what the US has done and tell me that you're a fan of this, right? Because this is what I'm criticizing. So scaling back the CIA, scaling back the FBI, and putting someone in charge of the FBI who's now been shown to have taken money from both China and Russia. That's Kash Patel. So that's scaling back counterterrorism, scaling back counter intelligence, disbanding the unit that looks at kleptocracy and seizing Russian assets, disbanding the department that looks at foreign interference into US elections, stopping US aid just like that, which is the US's foreign projection of power. Stopping, now we've had Elon Musk stopping RFE, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty, which is the US's essentially propaganda arm, again projecting soft power across Europe. That was partly responsible for the fall of communism. And I could go on. I could go on and on and on. So if you are happy with all of those things taking place, then me and you are speaking different language, because I don't think any of them are to the benefit of the US's power globally. And I think every single one of those benefits who? Russia and China. Now, send me the receipts, show me how that's not the case. If you can show me how each one of those points I just made, and I can add another 10 points on top of that, Denton, unless of course you're a Russian troll, you can show me how each one of those is not to the benefit of Russia and China, then I will stand corrected and I will grant you whatever you want about me. But as far as I'm concerned, one, I'm not being anti-American. I'm being anti-stupid decisions that do not benefit America, do not benefit the world, and do benefit China and Russia. End of rant.
And that's not to bake ourselves in. I just recorded an episode this morning where we talked about where Britain is going. We're not immune from making really daft decisions. We are not immune from shooting ourselves in the foot, which I happen to believe, Brexit was. Whatever the intentions behind it, whatever attitude people have to this amorphous thing called sovereignty, whatever actual genuine grievance they have with European institutions, which can appear very opaque from a democratic point of view, can appear unrepresentative. whatever genuine reasons are driving people towards it, we have to accept that the Brexit has been extremely damaging, and yet we have a process of normalization in the media, pretending that we are not in the dire state we are. And actually, Brits can look at America and go, "Ha, of course, of course they're doing this. Of course they're in a pickle." And we're not so silly as that. Well, unfortunately, we are as silly as that. And unfortunately, a Russian puppet party, which very closely resembles Ivanishvili's party in Georgia, is now the second most popular in the UK, which is Reform. It's a Russian puppet operation to dismantle Britain's power and status in the world. That's my absolute belief. It's not a party with a traditional prospectus, well thought through, ideologically based policies, etc. It's a puppet operation to take our country and its influence in the world apart. So we're not immune from this danger of populism. We're not immune from the normalization of the abnormal, and we're not immune from the sort of democratic vacuum which is allowing populists to thrive. And our media is extremely oligarchical and lacks a certain self-examination, unfortunately.
Absolutely, I don't disagree at all. And just adding to that rant that I just laid out for you guys, again, like, what do we make of decisions like this? And thank you very much for Thierry for pointing this out to me. So Politico reports that Donald Trump is considering nominating former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, who served 8 years in prison on corruption charges, to be US ambassador to Serbia. So remember, Serbia, with Vucic having protests at the moment, is not exactly transparent, is seemingly very corrupt, is basically looking towards Russia. So Trump, again, is what two buckets? Which of the two buckets do you put this decision into? Is this a pro-transparency, anti-corruption, pro-democracy, pro-fairness, anti-Russia, anti-China bucket? Or is it all the opposite of this? Trump decides, you can decide to put anyone as ambassador to Serbia, but you choose to put someone that's been in prison for 8 years on corruption charges as ambassador. It would be entirely consistent with the most corrupt US administration since Nixon to appoint a convicted grifter who recently appeared in Serbia to support Vucic. So this is a Vucic supporting person that's being put in prison for corruption, not without charge, naturally, to an ambassadorial post. Again, like, the decisions being made, again, just consistently seem to support China and Russia.
Definitely. And a question I asked earlier, actually, a conversation I had earlier, is we tend not to look in the US at the US as vulnerable to these processes. We tend not to say that there's a toolkit of authoritarianism rolling out in the US, and draw comparisons with Georgia, Slovakia, Hungary, and these places where the Russian toolkit of state capture, or various aspects of it, have been used. But if we were to draw that together as a series of processes, do you think we could draw some strong conclusions that actually that same process of state capture and the mechanics, the mechanisms of it, are clearly identifiable in many of the actions and decisions of this Trump administration, even at its earlier stage? Or we should say Musk administration, because it seems that he is pulling a lot of the strings.
100%. You look at what's happening with regard to the latest legal challenges to what primarily Musk has done. So the whole Doge activity has now been challenged in court. He's been asked to destroy all of the information that he's gathered on the US electorate, on taxpayers, etc., and other things have been stopped. And you've got now JD Vance, the VP, the vice president, saying that actually the judges should be impeached or ignored, etc. This is exactly what autocrats and dictators do. Is you either have control of the judiciary, so you have it in your pocket, or you or or you ignore them, and it's an entirely worrying time. I'll just bring up a few examples of this that I had ready for my American video, but just to in line with what you were saying there, Jonathan. So Trump appointed judge rules against Trump and Elon's attempt to fire thousands of USAID workers without cause. The judge noted that Elon and Doge bags have provided zero evidence of corruption or fraud at USAID, which is what some people have been saying on the threads. Oh, but what about the fraud and corruption? Well, that actually they haven't provided any evidence yet. I know some of you are fans of his, and we should all be for cutting wasteful spending, but this is not that. This is illegal. This is already costing lives. But then if you go on to look at the details here, so if judges freezing these moves and asking for data to be destroyed. Musk has cut off from government payment system. A US court has restricted Department of Government Efficiency from accessing the federal payment processing system. And it was a lawsuit filed by attorneys general from 19 different states, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so then you get this situation, which is happening. They broke the law. The courts blocked them. Now they're attacking the very legitimacy of those courts. This is how democracies die. So you've got Tom Cotton, a US senator, outrageous Obama judge, Paul Engelmeyer. And interestingly, they are not taking, even though these have been decisions by both Trump judges and Obama judges, they're not attacking the Trump judges. They're attacking the Obama judges. Engelmeyer didn't just bar Elon Musk and Doge from Treasury systems. He barred the Secretary of the Treasury, blah, 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 blah. Judicial interference with legitimate acts of state, especially the internal functioning of the co-equal branches, a violation of separation of powers. So they're starting to attack the legal system. J.D. Vance, if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. So he's saying that, but it's literally what the judges are for. So J.D. Vance, says Alex Cole, a Yale-educated lawyer and sitting VP, claims judges can't check executive power. That's literally their job. Courts overturned Nixon, Bush, and Trump. If judges couldn't rule on executive actions, presidents would be kings. Yeah, Vance calling on Trump to ignore judges. But Vance has been saying this for a long time. So sorry to spend a lot of time on this, Jonathan. This is a quote from something going back to 2021. And yet define the courts as something Vance has repeatedly suggested. Quote, if I was giving, this is Vance quoting, if I was giving him, Trump, one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, and replace them with our people. And when the courts, because you will get taken to court, and when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. They want to either ignore the courts or go on and replace them with their own people. So this is autocracy 101. This is a move towards dictatorship.
And I think, again, I've stopped using sort of these phrases like fascist or look at him as a fascist, because the minute you start putting labels on people, they will entrench their views. They will not examine their views or consider other evidence or opinions. I think people immediately get defensive if you place these labels on them. So perhaps these terms, X is a fascist, Y is a fascist, is no longer actually very useful. But pointing out some of these hypocrisies by looking at the detail, the evidence of where, let's say, constitutional violations take place, where violations of due process take place. I think this is this is a more useful aspect, which is like, talking to, let's say, someone on the right in the US and say, look, if you are for freedom, if you are for the Constitution, if you are for small government, then explain to me how this, that, and the other accords with your worldview. And that may be, well, yes, we might think this, but that's not the way to create an empathetic dialogue and to get people who are stuck down these rabbit holes to start questioning, their own support for, say, Trump or some of the actions that are taking place. There are a lot of people who are not Trumpists who are saying, well, maybe USAID was wasteful. Maybe there wasn't democratic oversight. And, what got Trump elected was a decades-long frustration with Washington bureaucracy. So I think, as difficult as it might be, I think we need to engage empathetically with the people who are enabling what we're seeing happening here.
There will, of course, be wasteful spending in every single department. So, this is not to inoculate the American government from having cost-cutting exercises take place. You could start with the Department of Defense that has failed countless audits, right? So, USAID had an audit 3 months ago. The Department of Defense, every time it has an audit, it fails it. And yet that gets $900 billion. So, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. By the way, Denton, don't accuse me of having TDS, because that just makes me want to dismiss you even more so. Like, that's the kind of labeling we were just talking about. Although I think, I would argue that there are clear fascistic hallmarks in a lot of what is going on with, and people in the live chat talked about Peter Thiel. JD Vance is one of the acolytes of Peter Thiel, and when you look at techno-fascism or techno-authoritarianism, literally listen to the words of Peter Thiel, that is fascism coming through, I would argue. And so, but if you're going to accuse me of TDS, that's just inoculating yourself from ever hearing criticism against what I would presume is a kind of demigod figure that Trump has. I think once you place a single individual on a pedestal so much, you do it so much so that they are unfortunately inoculated from criticism, because any criticism becomes blasphemy, and so criticism here becomes TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, and it just means that there's no one can ever criticize your god figure, and that then excuses that god figure from being able to do whatever the hell they want without criticism. So it's very dangerous to start going down that kind of road, in my opinion. But yeah, rant over.
Yeah. Definitely, I'll be on board for that, which is why I want to move away from the sort of, the fascistic labels and look at individual acts and how those individual acts can be criticized, and bring home to people what the end result of those acts might be. Yes, we might see a sort of pattern in these behaviors, and we might see analogies to historical periods where, governments and checks and balances and the rule of law were dismantled comprehensively, and what that led to. But I think, that those labels are unfortunately going to get people throwing up, labels in return. It's not necessarily helpful. I mean, one of the things I'm asking people is, okay, so you've got this bull in the china shop, which is Musk, Doge, and Trump. They're tearing things down. And you might believe that these things needed to be questioned. They needed to be torn down. They needed to have a full audit. Okay, where's your evidence that these are going to be built back up again? Where's your evidence that there's actually going to be a process in place to say, right, well, okay, here's our strategic objective. Here are recipients of US aid, which actually are doing a good job. And this is the path to resurrect funding for them based on certain criteria. Well, if this is the argument of what you're all up for, then you need to look out for evidence that there's some kind of process going on to resurrect it. And I think, that's the kind of rational argument we need to try and engage people in.
Thank you very much, Hutch. I don't know who you mean by Jonathan 2.0. This was on my channel, but it might be for you. This is for Jonathan 2.0. I'm a conservative in the USA. It is hard to be a moderate right in this political environment. I really agree here. I really feel sorry for classic conservatives, Reagan Republicans at the moment, because I don't think they have a home. And I think the GOP has been hijacked by a MAGA form of populism, and it's exactly the same in the UK, by the way. So what Jonathan Fink was talking about reform earlier, the reform is basically MAGA UK style, and the Conservative Party at the moment in the UK has had this identity crisis, and it's trying to work out whether it needs to go harder to the right to appeal to get back the voters that they've lost to reform, because reform at the moment are doing really, really well in the polls, or do they go to the kind of moderate right and the kind of small c conservatism of old, but then they lose that populist right, and they're trying to work that out. But for the time being, conservatives in the UK still have a home. Those old school conservatives in the US at the moment don't really have a home. And I was listening to Adam Kinzinger and Phillips O'Brien talk about this the other day, and talk about how the Democrats, kind of like they did just, and you could argue that that's maybe why they didn't succeed, because they didn't go populist left. But the Democrats tried to appeal to the Republicans big time and get those moderate Republicans on their side. And they were saying, actually, they need to still continue to do that because these people don't have a home. But anyway, Hutch says, we are constantly attacked on the right by being called rhinos, which means Republican in name only. So these are MAGAs saying you're not really Republican. It's a no true Scotsman fallacy, if you know what that is. And it's obviously nonsense, because I would argue they're far more Republican than the MAGA Republicans have ever been. Anyway, and they get attacked on the left for being called fascist. 30% of them plus have no home, and I don't think that is. I mean, that's a problem with not having a pluralist political system. When you've got a two-party, very narrow democratic system, it's the worst form of democracy, and that is an issue. It's an issue we are coming to terms with in the UK. Even though we have first past the post, we have started to get a more pluralist landscape with more parties playing a really important part. In the US, it's just the system just makes it impossible for that to happen, and so I think that's a real issue. But anyway, thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Yeah, and this is a challenge one, because reform is pointing to issues which are either brushed over or not given sort of an adequate addressing, but also there are certain issues which are very easily weaponized. I mean, immigration being one, cultural diversity being another, and I think what we don't realize is it doesn't take an absolute majority. You don't require an absolute majority in order to fall down into what is a populist revolutionary phase. Trump's base is what at most about sort of the hardcore base is sort of 30%, 25, 30%. I think you could probably say the same for reform, but it's those who are disaffected with traditional politics who may lend their weight, an enabling force. Can bring this sort of extremist populism to power, even though a lot of what it does may be unpalatable even for those who vote for it. But their disaffection from traditional parties and traditional politics is even greater. And of course, that in itself is easy to weaponize using the sort of Russian toolkit. Even if Russia isn't directly doing it, we have to recognize that Russia has developed a toolkit for authoritarians, which they can use to destabilize, the systems they operate in. Again, this stuff no longer requires, a KGB handler. It no longer requires massive investment of Russian resources to create this sort of instability. In fact, it's feeding off a lot of the instability that we actually have in democratic societies, especially these sort of late stage democracies, which seem to be losing their way a little bit, losing a sense of force and will associated with their values of democracy. That's why I think one of the Russian techniques which is most insidious and works best is the sort of the one which is неоднозначно, which means it's more complex than you think, and it's the kind of moral and political relativism saying, yes, well, there's no such thing as democracy, or well, one party is as bad as another, and blah blah blah. It's the sort of injection of nihilism into our system, which is the most dangerous thing. If ever I'm arguing with somebody, and they inject one of these relativistic arguments, I'm like, just stop for a minute. Just stop, because what's the point in talking if you actually have, no hard and fast values whatsoever? No, we have to create some little rocks or little islands that we can perch upon, especially with the rising tide of authoritarianism. The minute you fall into some kind of relativist thinking, you are fundamentally lost.
Lots of really interesting views coming out in the live chat. Of course, we don't have time to discuss them all. I want to move on to the peace plans, which I think are so important, and I'm likely to get a bit ranty here, Jonathan, so I do apologise. But the good news is, first of all, Edward Hunter Christie here saying very good that Keith Kellogg is meeting with other European leaders in addition to his talks with the Ukrainian side. So Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavsky, who is very pro-Ukraine, met with Keith Kellogg during his visit to Washington. I think that people like Keith Kellogg and Mike Waltz need to, and Pete Hegseth, the guy in charge, the Secretary of Defense, need to spend as much time speaking to people outside of their own little bubbles as possible, because I think that there is this kind of potential for people in those positions around the Trump administration to just listen to an echo chamber of views that don't take into account, well, Ukraine for a start, European views, etc., etc. Now, as we move on to what's going on with peace plans, Trump has said he's likely to meet with Zelensky next week. In particular, he plans to discuss the security of assets such as rare earth metals. I've already cast my opinion on this, which is I think it's probably practically sensible for Ukraine to start talking about dealing some of their natural resources out to the US because he's so transactional. But I do feel very uncomfortable with this because on the one hand, you've got Russia using as one of their rationale for one of their reasons for invading Ukraine will be to exploit the natural resources in their new imperialistic target, and everyone going, that's disgusting, we want to stop Russia from invading and taking Ukraine's natural resources. And so America comes along and says, right, we're going to help you, and by the way, the payment for helping you to stop losing your natural resources to Russia is your natural resources. So America get your natural resources and not Russia. So I do find that really deeply problematic, but I also understand that from a practical point of view, why they might be entertaining that idea. Any thoughts on that before we go into the details?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is also built on an absolute logical inconsistency here, as well as some disinformation. So I can see why this argument is really important. Trump is transactional. He is looking for not just where he personally, but also people in his regime can make a pile of money. Absolutely. Now, that unfortunately perhaps is not so different from many administrations and the sort of friends and lobbyists who would influence Biden as well as previous administrations. So let's not get too much, this is like a pure Trump thing. No, this is unfortunately the sort of oligarchic politics which many of societies, and especially the US, has been slipping into for many decades, in fact. It's just that that's accelerating now. Now, the problem, I think, here is that on the one hand, Trump says, look, Europe's not pulled its way. US is giving so much more to Ukraine than it has done through the war. Well, that is demonstrably false. Europe collectively has given more in terms of civilian aid, and indeed has actually started to pull its weight with the military aid as well. So this is just a pure piece of self-aggrandizing disinformation to say Europe hasn't done anything. So if we look at the information, so well, actually Europe has been pulling its weight. Why should the US charge in? One, expect Europe to shoulder the main burden of supporting Ukraine in the future, to have boots on the ground, etc. That's what Trump is probably rightly pushing Europe to do, but then swoop in and clean up in terms of the wealth and the extraction. I mean, it's just, it's counter-logical. And if anyone's watching this who is a Trump supporter, you have to see the logic behind this. Europe must do everything, and yet we're going to get all the cash out of it. Well, that just doesn't make sense.
You've beaten me to it, because one of my rant points was going to be exactly that. That hang on, how come the US, who have actually, statistically done less than Europe, how come they get to demand all the rare earth metals, and the US says you guys need to do more, and then we are doing more, like the EBRD and the European Committee, all sorts of European Peace Facility, all sorts of entities piling money into Ukraine. And it's like, well, we haven't asked for rare earth metals. So you could argue, well, more fool the EU, maybe they should have been more transactional. And as was it Cheryl said, this is just Trump being more honest, just saying, well, actually, here it is. Trump has just been more honest about being only interested in wars for resources. Now, I think that is naturally that is a very normal thing. So the reason we didn't go and get involved in, as I always use an example, Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, because we had no natural resources to gain from that. We got involved in Kuwait and Iraq because of oil, Libya because of oil, etc., etc. So yes, there is this understanding that natural resources are always going to play a part in why we are involved in certain conflicts around the world. But there's also an awful lot to be said for larger, sort of longer term objectives, which I don't think Trump seems to have any kind of cognizance of. Trump announced plans to meet with Zelensky next week. He once again spoke about the sheer numbers of dead and wounded and stated that it would have never happened had he been president, of course. Trump also says they aim at securing rare earth metals from Ukraine. Zelensky on a potential rare earth metals deal with the US, quote, "If we're talking about a deal, then let's do a deal. We are only for it. The Americans help the most." And I think he's being somewhat appeasing the Trump character there, because I think you can argue that it depends what you mean by the most. Anyway, we won't go down that road again. And therefore, the Americans should earn the most. I have a problem with that, and they should have this priority, and they will. I would also like to talk about this with President Trump. I think that's a bit of a problem, stating it so overtly there, especially when you look at the amount of money that the EU together has poured into Ukraine. It doesn't quite look that way. And then just a few more points. Ukraine is not going to give away its mineral resources to Trump or other Western partners. We can only talk about their joint development in close partnership. So that's a really important, that's Reuters. That's a really important distinction there. Other theses of the Ukrainian president: Trump may demand that Putin return these assets. Zelensky stressed that the United States, as a main partner, should receive priority in cooperation. Russia has occupied about half of Ukraine's rare earth deposits, which is a problem. We need to stop Putin and protect the strategically important Dnipro region and central Ukraine. And the idea of using Ukrainian underground gas storage facilities to store US liquefied natural gas is being considered. So he's really playing to that transactional nature of Trump there. Any thoughts on that?
It is, and I can see why. I can see why this is happening. You have to get his attention somehow, and this is a pretty smart strategy to do it. Also, the assumption here is that Ukraine has promised everything. Well, it hasn't. If you look at this figure, that there are potentially trillions of dollars worth of resources in the ground. Actually, the current conversations are for billions, not the full, trillion or so. So I think, again, it's much more of a measured conversation than the headlines would give credit for. Also, how do you extract some of these? It's assuming that the sort of 1 point whatever it is trillion is easily accessible. Well, a lot of it is not, and a chunk of it is in the East. So I don't know what the excuse me.
Excuse you. Well, I'll take out, because I was just reading.
I've been talking so much, I kind of lost the plot here. But it will require considerable investment to gain a lot of these assets, and some of them are under occupied territory. Some of them are in territory which is easier for Russia to fire upon. So it's a clever strategy, because you're offering something which is not readily, snaffleable.
Just at this point here, USA has helped the most if you count individual countries. Yeah, but USA has a bigger GDP and a bigger population than any of those individuals. So that kind of comparison is kind of moot. But when Trump is denigrating Europe, he's denigrating Europe as a whole. So he's saying Europe needs to pick up. He's not saying Lithuania needs to pick up more, because Lithuania is a tiny country. And he's not saying, France. He's saying Europe as a whole. So therefore, we need to deal with Europe as a whole when comparing to the US. And when we're dealing with Europe as a whole, then actually Europe has, according to the Kiel Institute, Ukraine support tracker, given more total allocated aid and pledged aid to Ukraine. And so that's what we're talking about, when actually it's unfair for Trump to lie about that situation. And then it's also possibly unfair to say that, well, the US get to have all of the natural resources of Ukraine in this exploitative manner.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know if you got the figures there, but if you look at it as GDP as a per head of population, I think you'll find that it's relatively low. If you look at it in terms of overall GDP and per head of population as well, Europe is batting above its weight.
Yes, and we did used to have that. They keep changing the way that they show these. That's in billion. That's in billion. I remember the last time I looked at it per as a percentage of GDP, or I think it was that, then the US was way down the list, and that's very interesting. You had obviously countries like Denmark and the Baltics, much further at the top. This one here is what you want to see, but it doesn't include the US. It's just by by their GDP, but only the EU. So I'd like to see that with the US included. But anyway,
and that's EU, so it doesn't show you Britain in the
and Norway as well.
Table. Yeah, of course. Yeah. And it also ignores the fact that actually there are numerous enterprises, say in France and other countries, that have pre-existing agreements to extract certain minerals and so on from Ukrainian lands. So it presumes that there's a complete blank slate that you can sort of make these demands. Well, actually, no, there are complications. There are already international entities that have contracts agreements with Ukraine. There is a big chunk of where these minerals are located that is in occupied territory, occupied by Russia. And these are not trivial things to just sort of ride a coach and horses through. If Trump is going to benefit from these minerals, and I think it's prudent to create some kind of plan whereby his administration would benefit. You have to resolve that problem of the occupied territories. It's no good just freezing the lines of contact and saying, okay, whatever Russia has stolen is now Russian sovereign territory. All the people on these territories are now Russian. That flies in the face of the reality here. Russia has committed crimes and theft on a monumental scale. Gifting these things to Russia would be an implicit endorsement of this criminality, and also it would stop Trump getting his hands on these resources. So that's a question they have not provided a good answer to.
Jess Slater's absolutely on the money here. Trump sees the EU simply as a competitor. Absolutely agree. So there's lots of writing on Trump's transactional nature. Madeleine Albright's excellent book Fascism, where she looks at modern iterations of fascism and actually talks about Donald Trump in that regard. And I know that's pertinent maybe to the language you were talking about earlier, Jonathan. But her section in there about and her first-hand experience of Trump's transactionalism was an interesting part of that book, where he sees things as everything in a zero-sum game way, which is like, if you gain, then we lose. Just that's it. It is anyone else's gain is our loss. And so therefore he doesn't understand alliances, and this is why he doesn't understand positive sum gains and things like the NATO alliance. So we all put money in, and okay, the US might be putting more money in than everyone else, not in, because that's an incorrect understanding. We spend more on our defense than any other country, but then we also get to dictate global affairs more, and we also get to help ourselves to trade deals and natural resources more than these other countries, and we have our bases everywhere else, and those countries don't have bases in our places. So we'll come on to talk about this soon. So I think it's a real problem when you just look in a purely transactional manner at things like NATO defense expenditure, but also understanding the world in those really simplistic terms. If Putin gets Ukraine, or Ukraine joined the EU, it's exactly the same outcome for Trump. Zelensky sees this, and that's why you see some of that rhetoric, and I'd agree with that.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, speaking to Ukrainians, we've had a lot of conversations recently. Ukraine is on a route to wanting better governance, more robust institutions, tackling corruption. This is what most Ukrainians want. They want to move closer to what the ideal was of Western democracy, that kind of democracy that triumphed over communism. And it's a world of rule of law, increasing wealth, predictability, stability, but underpinned by a sort of strong institutions and good governance. Now, Ukraine doesn't, it doesn't have that. It doesn't have that perfect state. One could argue that that no country does, but they see some of that in the EU. And they see some of that in member states of the EU. So Ukraine is naturally moving towards a European view of the world. They must be looking at what's happening in the States and thinking, well, we don't want that. We don't want this dismantling of checks and balances. We don't want to move towards a capricious, authoritarian, oligarch-led version of society. We've just spent the last 3 decades trying to move away from that.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to sort of move on now, if I may, Jonathan, to so much in the live chat. Someone accusing me of moving the goalposts. I have no idea what they're talking about, but yeah, all sorts going on in live chat of both of our channels. Now, let's get on to this peace plan then. So USA National Security Advisor Mike Walls has said that once the war in Ukraine is over, European nations will have to own this conflict. And this is where I was thinking I might get a bit ranty, because like we have this idea that America's paying way more than Europe. Not true. That America gets to help itself to the natural resources of Ukraine. That this needs to be Europe's war. That, we're fed up of being Europe's defender, and we're fed up of spending more on defense than Europe, etc., etc. And we hear this so often that I've got to a point, and I had this in my first video this morning, where I'm like, do you know what? I'm really pissed off with being scolded by the Americans here, when this is a result of the Cold War. This is a result of your objectives in spreading your ideology. And I'm not, by the way, I think that's a good thing. I didn't want communism, and I prefer American capitalism. I'm somewhat of a mixed capitalism with sensible regulation, but I get the point. I'm much rather an American hegemony than a Russian or Chinese hegemony, right? So I think it was a good thing that America was involved in European security for the last 70 years plus. Okay. But you don't get to do all that to secure your own power around the world and to give yourself a launching pad by having literally a launching pad, by having nukes in RAF Lakenheath, by having bases all around Europe, in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, lots of bases in Germany, in the UK, right? And then complain that we're not spending enough because you spent that because you put your bases there. So my point here is, if you're going to keep whinging about Europe, then you can take your bases and you can shove them up your ass. You can take all of your American military bases in Europe and in UK, and you can take them away. Because if you want us to own our own security, then we will own our own security, and you can fuck off. Like, I've got to this, I'm sorry to swear, but I've got to this point where I'm a little bit annoyed at people like Mike Walls scolding us, and then still saying we shouldn't be paying as much as you, and then saying, oh, by the way, we're going to still pay lots to have bases in all your countries so we can project our power around the world. But by the way, you can't have any bases in our country. Like, how many European bases are in the US? None. Okay, so I've got to a point where I'm like, I'm a little bit annoyed at this present administration's approach to how this war plays out. Sorry.
There's a certain amount of having your cake and eating it about the whole thing, isn't there? Like, you dare not project your power. You dare not, pop your head above the parapet. And there are some justified criticisms about Europe, not footing the bill for its own security, not reacting to what we're now into the third year of full-scale war, and we have been asleep at the wheel. We continue, many European countries, to be, hitting the
Agreed.
snooze button.
Yeah.
Not the case for Poland, not the case for the Baltics. The
Spain,
Nordics are kind of
Portugal.
waking up a little bit, but yeah, there's a huge core of Europe that includes Britain, which is not investing its own security. We're going through a strategic defence review, and that has almost been nobbled by the Treasury putting a cap on what its conclusion should be. Behind the scenes, I think the conclusion that they would like to draw people involved in that defence review is that, we need to go up to 3.5% of GDP to have just an adequate defence, never mind full defence. That's just to hold the Russians at bay if their ambitions grow beyond Ukraine. But that's been nobbled, and they're being prevented, it's said, from reaching any conclusion that goes 2.5% beyond GDP. So we're not doing what we need to do to defend ourselves in Europe, and that is justified. But this cakeism is quite sort of revolting.
Yeah, and I almost want Europe to call America's bluff and say, okay, you really want us. Do you really want us to take responsibility for our own security? Honestly, I'd love to see this happen, just to see what the reaction is. Do you really want us? Do you really want us? Yes. And Trump's administration goes, yes, yes, yes. Okay, please take every single one of your troops out of Europe. Please take your nuclear weapons out of the UK and Europe. Please take every element of US military power out of Europe, and we'll sort it out ourselves. Thank you very much. And then see how much the US's ability to go and bulldoze Gaza will be affected, because they can't use Europe as a launch pad. Those air bases in I don't know where the US fly from. I know that the UK flies from Cyprus and Romania. The US will be flying from those places as well. But if they get kicked out of Europe, then the US is unable to do what they do in supporting Israel in taking out Iranian drones and etc., etc. And things become very difficult. You say, actually, the Mediterranean, that's largely European Sea. Thank you very much. You can take your ships out of there. And so this is having your cake and eating it. But I feel really strongly about this, that in the news, that when, and people, part of the problem at the moment is that half of America think it's all going swimmingly because half of America is watching Twitter or Fox News, and so they don't understand some of the damage that's being done to the US's international standing here. But I would just love to see how the US reacted if the EU, if Europe stood up and backed themselves and told US to go and do one.
And it's not just Europe. I mean, criticism can be leveled at Canada for not pulling its weight in terms of its military contribution to the North Atlantic Alliance. And this is absolutely true. And it must be intensely frustrating from not just this administration, but multiple American administrations. That, however, does not justify the absolute attacks on allies and this constant allusion to the absorption of a state like Canada, and the implication that Canada is not a viable country if it wasn't for the US. That is clearly absolutely ludicrous, and it's a grotesque kind of slur against a long-standing ally. As Canadians have pointed out, they've committed troops to almost all the US military campaigns and adventures over the last sort of 70 years, fought side by side, and including in 2 world wars with the US. So what we're seeing is this sort of the very worst ingratitude and gutter language, as well as extreme transaction, not values-based, not conservative thinking. We're seeing a sort of revolutionary transactional populism being expressed by Trump, which is a slap in the face for traditional allies. And I think that needs to be understood more. It's all very well having empathy for people on the right in America and all the reasons why they voted in this bull in the china shop regime. but they also need to realize that what's being said and what's being done is extremely damaging to relationships that have taken many decades to build, and which huge amounts have been sort of sunk in terms of commitment on both sides in these relationships, with Europe, Canada, and others, into that relationship with the US. There is perhaps not an appreciation of how damaging what's rolling out actually is.
Yeah, and this Lisa UTA is exactly right. I think Macron is arguing for exactly this. Europe must stand without US and can if there's a will. And yeah, it's been long advocating for that. And then you get onto discussions about European army, etc., etc. Ed Jones, on the other hand, says totally understand your point, JP, but this should be the time for unity and not division. I agree. And we were united, but the present administration seems to be very intent on denigrating Europe while not particularly putting Ukraine's needs at the forefront, but putting transactional objectives at the forefront. And I think that's a bit of a problem.
I agree with that one. I mean, I unfortunately, I see, the comment previously, and I get the sentiment behind it. It's a nice thought that Europe can stand on its own. I see no evidence that it can, and that it will pull together in time. This comes back to, what does China have planned for this whole thing? And where does this attritional war lead? Because if we think this is just a regional conflict between two Soviet powers that have, a lot of similarities, Russia and Ukraine, if we just see it as a regional attritional conflict, then the cessation of hostilities is, as undesirable as that, the way in which that war may come to an end. If that's your view, then that's an end of it. Whereas if this is part of a larger geopolitical game, if this is a global struggle of authoritarian governance against democratic governance, then a negotiated solution in Ukraine is simply a pause in what, one could almost put it like a draw in what is a much larger confrontation. And I'm not sure we're seeing it in those terms at the moment, when really we should be.
Interesting question from Polestar. How independent is the UK from the US related to defense and military capabilities? Well, in a very important way, nuclear, we are dependent on the US. And this is, so France has an advantage over the UK. Our nuclear system, I think it may even require us permission from the US to pull a trigger. So our nuclear deterrent is completely dependent on the US in terms of technology and everything, whereas the French have a completely independent system, which is why France is quite separate from NATO. Quite often, when NATO were wanting to go into the Red Sea, the French did their own thing, I think, recently. So France has this kind of very independent streak, and they do have an advantage. They have, we've got to remember, they've got the second biggest arms exporter. They are the second biggest arms exporter in the world. France are a really big arms nation, potentially. As well as they actually are, but there's a lot of scope as well for them to drive European defense strategy, and it's no surprise that they are wanting the European defense strategy to stick to procuring stuff from within Europe, because obviously that will benefit their own arms industry, and they have their own independent nukes and so on and so forth. So France are in a very different position from the UK.
That's it. And it has a little more capability, perhaps, on the artillery side, and it's preserved maybe more of its core army. One might question, the willingness of that army to act when push comes to shove, based on historical behaviors. That might be a little bit mean towards the French, but certainly we've wound our capabilities down to a point where they could hardly, resist Russians for very long, even at the level of incompetence that we've often seen with, the Russian forces, their meat wave tactics, the poor equipment, logistics, etc. Despite all of these things, it is perfectly possible that Russia could field overwhelming numbers, which European superiority in tactics and combined arms may not be able to resist. Now, I'm not I'm not a military expert. I'm going to put that straight out there. And there are going to be certain people who sort of, tell me I'm talking absolutely out of my arse. But I've been to enough events to see that there are people who are military experts who fundamentally disagree on this point amongst themselves. So, people might speak with a huge amount of authority and confidence, especially those from within the NATO structures, and say, no, absolutely, of course, Russia will never be able to beat us, blah, blah, blah. While acknowledging some of the fundamental issues, there are experts, such as Keir Giles, who will point out that actually there's a huge amount of highly optimistic and self-interested thinking of those that, have done rather well out of being part of, these security structures of the last few years.
Yeah, just answering the question there, just did a quick Google. The UK's nuclear deterrent is not completely independent from the United States. The UK relies on the US for technology, maintenance and logistics, and has a formal treaty with the US that allows the US to share classified information, so on and so forth. But let's just go to Anton Gerashchenko. We need to rush through a bunch of this because I've kept you longer than I normally do. I'd happily just talk forever. Anton Gerashchenko says, United States National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said that once a war in Ukraine is over, European nations will have to own this conflict, as mentioned before. In terms of security guarantees, he added, that is squarely going to be with the Europeans. So not only do the Europeans have to own this, they have to provide security guarantees, they have to provide much more money and arms, and the US get the rare earth metals. This is a signal that the post-World War II global security system is now over, says Anton Gerashchenko, and this is the point, as well as the guarantees provided by the Budapest Memorandum to Ukraine. So we've got to remember that the US is contractually obliged to do the security guarantees for Ukraine. A new era is dawning. It is important that not just European countries realize this, but also South Korea and Taiwan. Reviewing deterrence and security systems must now take place. I think Europe is already starting to adjust to the new geopolitical reality. Ukraine will strengthen Europe as part of the European defense system and will be an effective deterrent of Russia. European security guarantees to Ukraine are a great investment into security of the European continent. So here we have Anton Gerashchenko also talking about a move away from the US. So it's not just me getting ranty, but actually this is what is being discussed. And it is a case of the US pushing Europe away, it seems, rather than Europe wanting to be independent. Now, Keith Kellogg is preparing to present options to Trump for ending the war in Ukraine per semaphore. This is fascinating because Trump told the electorate he was going to solve this war within 1 day of the inauguration, and he said even before the inauguration. So that was obviously a barefaced lie. And I think, and I keep repeating this because it needs to, like, for those in the threads who are still listening to this, those of you in a live chat who are big Trump fans of Trump, he lied to you. He either lied to you or he didn't understand global geopolitics enough as to make any kind of statement on it, and yet he did so. So either way, it's deeply irresponsible, either as a liar or as someone who's completely uninformed, casting opinions on very complex matters. He said he would solve it in 1 day, and he hasn't even been presented with a freaking plan yet. That is not acceptable. That is not acceptable. I do not like people lying to their potential voters before an election. And I think that's what happened. And people got sucked in by populism. Simple answers to complex problems. It's not good enough. Anyway, I've got to go on. Ukraine's place in the common European security architecture. New US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth will spend next week in Europe. This is good news. Beginning in Germany, where he plans to visit the headquarters of the US Army's European and African commands. See African Command in Europe. American African Command in Europe. If you want Europe to be completely independent and blah 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 blah, and we kick the US out of Europe, then where's your African Command going to be? You'd be all the way back over in the US. Anyway, US Vice President J.D. Vance will meet with Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference. That's good news as well. I think that needs to happen lots. The New York Post has claimed that Trump acknowledged having phone calls with Putin. In an exclusive interview, he said he spoke to Putin to find ways to end the war. And I ranted about this in my last video. Trump believes Putin cares about casualties. If you are so easily duped, then you are dangerous. It's dangerous that you're in that position, that Putin can dupe you by making you think that he actually freaking cares about casualties in Ukraine. It's the last thing that Putin cares about, and has
calling the war horrible. I mean, it's Putin's war, and every aspect of it, every grisly, nasty, horrific war crime that's been committed is a direct result of Putin's orders. And to say he doesn't know that this is taking place is ludicrous. He knows everything in terms of war crimes that's taking place, and he doesn't care, never has done.
Yeah, absolutely. But if honestly, if Trump honestly think Putin cares, then that shows how gullible Trump is, and that explains Trump coming out in 2018 after the Helsinki meeting with Putin and regurgitating Putin's talking points, and it's that proximity bias where he believes more vehemently the last thing that he was told. He was basically, he went in to meet with Putin, and there was only one other person in there, which was a translator. This was a private meeting. No one knows what happened in that meeting. And he came out completely, I think, beholden to Putin, and that makes the United States incredibly vulnerable because he's easy to be manipulated. Now, what do we see as well to support that claim? Well, Putin has made a claim that Europe, and so this gets me all ranty. Beware, guys, I might go off again. Putin says Europe will stand at the feet of the master as Trump's tariffs alarm allies. Happy to be on the sidelines, Russia's Kremlin says it's watching the tensions Trump's tariffs are spreading. To which, that is the article that Trump places on Truth Social. So Trump wants the world to know that A, Putin is happy, that B, Europe will be at the feet of the master, Donald Trump. Honestly, I'm not being anti-American. I'm being anti a dictator wannabe who wants his allies to quiver at his feet. Edward Hunter critically said Donald Trump happily posts a report that quotes Vladimir Putin as saying that Europe will soon be subjugated and obedient to Donald Trump, supposedly its master. This is absolutely unconscionable. And then you hear that Musk is shutting down Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America, saying Europe is free now, not counting stifling bureaucracy. Hello. Nobody listens to them anymore. And it's just a radical left, crazy people talking to themselves while torching $1 billion a year of US taxpayer money. As Kareem Rafai says, it's really difficult to justify the crusade against US aid for fiscal reasons when it becomes blatantly obvious that it's really just about annihilating American soft power across the board. And we've got Michael McFaul, the former ambassador to Russia for the United States, saying, by the way, Europe is not free. Belarus and Russia are still dictatorships. So Elon Musk is just ostensibly wrong. And that is what Radio Free Europe and Voice of America are battling against, the Russian and Belarusian narratives. That's literally, I report on the articles that they produce very often to my audience. And the fact that these guys are being shut down is an assault on American soft power around the world. So Musk is calling for them to be shut down. Yes, shut them down. Europe is free now, etc., etc. It's just terrible. Russia is beyond thrilled, says Julia Davis from Russian Media Monitor. Looking at Russian media, she has said they are beyond thrilled that Elon Musk wants to get rid of Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. So if the Russian propagandists on national television are like tooting their trumpets about this, then it's probably the wrong bloody decision.
Yes, is it? And it does, again, how do we engage with this? Because I mean, this immediately got me thinking. I'm going to look on YouTube to see what the viewing figures are of these channels, because my first instinct was outrage. Then I thought for it, but I thought in all of these 3 years, how much of their output have I actually watched as background research, creating my materials? And I tend to watch, I mean, you might talk for 4 or 5 hours a day. I tend to watch about sort of 4 or 5 hours a day of materials in Russian. And sorry, voice has gone again.
Do you want to take a couple of seconds, give yourself some mute, and I'll say I have a lot of trouble understanding Elon Musk and why he's in politics now, other than obvious money and power, says Napalm 1334. And another one here. This is Mad Bunny. three. So glad to hear someone be actually angry at what's going down. Musk is ending Western dominance. My friend, I can't tell you how angry I am. I really do hold myself back. This isn't performative. I am just, honestly, if I could just have an hour shouting at the webcam, I would. Like, because part of, I've talked to my audience about this a number of times before. I am obsessed with this war, and at its heart is unfairness, like an oppressive nation attacking a democratic, free and democratic nation that is trying to aspire to be greater, to be better, to be more democratic, to be more transparent. It has its goals set in the right direction. If you remember when you were interviewing the Ukrainian philosopher the other day in Ukraine, I was talking about how, in my question towards the end, I was talking about how I get the sense that Ukraine is looking to the future far more than Russia, whereas Russia looks to the past to be some kind of reiteration of what it was in the past, whereas Ukraine has this idea of what it could be, not what it is. It has a sense of place. It has a sense of history. Of course it does. Very proud history. And that goes back actually further than Russian history, you could argue. But it also has a really, really strong sense of what it wants to be, what it could be. And so when I see this oppressor attack Ukraine in this way, that's really what got my goat and why I'm still as obsessed as I am. It's about fairness. And then when I see what's going on in the United States at the moment with an unelected bureaucrat, billionaire, most powerful man on earth, this is a classic Bond villain. This is when you watch films and you get really pissed off with the evil guy because they're doing horrible things. Like, that's what I'm feeling now. I'm feeling that there's total unfairness in the world where the rich and powerful oligarchs are doing things untransparently for their own benefit, for the benefit of Russia and China, which themselves are autocracies and dictatorships. I'm deeply, deeply pissed off. I'm deeply angry because it's so unfair. It's so unfair, and I feel it. It courses through my veins. And here I am ranting to you guys. Anyway, over to you, Jonathan.
I've regained my voice there. It's been my sort of fourth hour of yabbering, and it's starting to give way. I'm looking at Radio Free Europe. It's got on YouTube, it's got 9.7 thousand videos, 800,000 subscribers, so it's reasonable kind of amount. It's been going on YouTube since 2008. And it's something like 500 million views or 540 million views. So that's sort of, reasonable long-term stats. Individual views that I can see that have been published recently, latest updates, one's got 13,000, one's got 47, one's got 15. So the stats are bouncing around in a way that is very similar to the scale of my channel, for instance. But that does lead me to think, what is the scale of funding behind it? What is the reach and what is the impact? And certainly there may be an argument to say that, some of these investments need to be held to account and need to be more measurable in terms of their impact and extending not just US soft power, but also democracy and shifting the balance towards Ukrainian victory. So I think there's room to have conversations to question, return on investment. And these are conversations we can have with people who are on more of the right spectrum of politics, and we can actually engage them and say, okay, let's think about how these things can be made more effective. But that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing a sledgehammer being taken. We're seeing sort of hooliganism and an absolute sledgehammer being taken to sort of good governance institutions. So I think that's the problem where we are at the moment. We need to find a common ground, because what we're seeing is just sort of out and out vandalism of these things, and yet many people are looking at it almost as a natural political process. They're looking at it as if this is a natural extension of conservative values and beliefs that have been moving for a number of decades, whereas what we're actually seeing is revolutionary populism. What we're actually seeing is a form of nihilism, which is destroying America's ability to project power and influence around the world. In that respect, it's deeply damaging, dangerous, and goes counter to what I would call our, natural conservative values.
Absolutely fascinating. Let's just absolutely race through some of these. So
Julia
again,
Davis is a star, though, by the way. I mean, if
yeah,
people
yeah,
aren't following
absolutely.
her, she's superb work.
Does some incredible work. USAID's administrators. So then what annoys me is then when people like Elon Musk spread outright disinformation. So the idea that USAID is corrupt and the person that runs it earned $23 million over 4 years is just it's just false. It's just a lie. And here's a guy trying to justify his own existence and doing what Doge does and shutting down these things by like lying to people about what those who run them earn and where the money goes. And it's just like, it's just there has to be something more that we can do against outright bold-faced lying. There should be no place for that kind of activity in society. And then here we've got Elon Musk. Well, Mike Nellis here. Musk has no idea what he's doing. He paid some kid to play video games for him, which is true. And now he's paying some kids to cut government spending for him too, which is true. Musk admitted today that he didn't even know that these kids are illegally cutting things like cancer research. The guy is fraud. So this is Molly John Fast saying, I don't think the richest guy in the world should be cutting funding for cancer research. Elon Musk says, I'm not. What the F are you talking about? And Molly John Fast then gives the news that the Trump administration is cutting billions of dollars in biomedical research funding, alarming academic leaders who said it would imperil their universities and medical centers. And of course, the NIH is being cut, USAID is being cut, all these things that then you're realizing that people, they're these farmers now complaining that they're losing contracts on food that was going to USAID. So what you're going to have is inflationary pressures, and you're going to have people losing jobs, which means they're going to be on unemployment benefit, which is then going to be, putting up the cost of government. And so there are so many like short-term things like let's cut, and you don't realize that actually you're going to be causing people to lose their jobs, their livelihoods, and whatnot around the world. It's not just about cutting federal, these federal jobs include, having contracts with private entities. So you cut those federal jobs and you cut those departments, then you cut the private entities that depend on those contracts, so on and so forth. It's insanity. But Zelensky, on the other hand, is pushing for a lasting and sustainable peace, and he'll be doing so at the Munich Security Conference. So hopefully he can get that through. But people, are Andrew Perpetua, someone that I refer a lot to, says, "Congrats, America! You've effed up so badly that you'll likely not be able to recover. Your enemies laugh at you from a distance, and you will slide deeper into poverty." And this is in response to Russia's strategy is quite similar. In Trump, we trust to do our work to dismantle U.S. global hegemony and make the U.S. just another regional power. They should focus on Greenland and Canada and stay away from Ukraine, and then we'll be friends. So that's what the Russians are thinking. But you need to recede from the rest of the world, concentrate on messing up with Canada and Greenland, and we as Russia will be happy with that. And America are obliging, to which Andrew Perpetua says, well done, US, you are basically shooting yourself in the foot. And in fact, there are lots of memes coming out. I think the Wall Street Journal had a meme, was it, of like Trump lifting up his leg and shooting himself in the foot, one of their political cartoons, something like that. But yeah, Chris Owicki, ironic that America spent 70 plus years fearing that it would be subverted and destroyed from within by communists, when it turns out that radical right South Africans were the insider threat all along. So you got Peter Thiel and obviously Elon Musk and David Sachs and the like. Trump is too scared to go after Russian oligarchs. Instead, he's attacking federal weather forecasters. So that's NOAA, isn't it? That they're defunding the weather service. HIV and AIDS patients and public school teachers, Department of Education, they were blocked from getting into the Department of Education. There was some thug, well, not a thug, but some rando outside not letting in lawmakers into the Department of Education. He flashed a badge and then took it away again. So no one knows who this guy is, not letting actual lawmakers, like members of parliament, if you like, members of Congress, into the Department of Education. It's insane. The Trump administration is kneeling to our adversaries and inflicting pain on our own people. Weak leadership from a weak man. And that's the news that Attorney General Pam Bondi is disbanding an effort started after Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine to enforce sanctions and target oligarchs close to the Kremlin. So that's getting rid of the kleptocracy unit that seizes Russian assets And then we have loyalty tests in the FBI. So new people looking to get jobs in the FBI are being asked to give a yes or no response, such as, was January the 6th an inside job? In other words, they are not paying fealty to the Constitution or to the United States of America. They're being asked to directly pay fealty to Donald Trump and his ideology, which is dictatorial. That is what you see in dictatorships. You have to pay fealty to the cult leader rather than to the idea of what the country is. It's deeply, deeply disturbing. And then we're going to finish off with a little bit on Germany. Anything to say to any of that, my friend?
No, I'm almost at a loss for words there, but it's a form of vandalism. What we're seeing, it's not about tearing things down so you can build something up. Despite what many people are arguing, it is a form of absolute vandalism with no conception of where it's ultimately going, and what institutions may replace the ones that are being trashed. And it's certainly in the favor of authoritarians. It's in the favor of Russia. It's in the favor of China. Whether that is the purpose or not, whether that is the conscious thinking of the people that are doing this, and we can't get inside their minds. We can't know absolutely whether that is or not. But in reality, that is who these moves are benefiting. It's the authoritarians are applauding it. Whether Russia in this third year of war is going to be in a position to leverage any of that is an open question. But certainly it's being welcomed by the propagandists, as you'd expect.
And that's what I was saying earlier, right at the beginning of the video. Which pot would you put this in? I know it is before you joined the live, Jonathan, but it was like, do we put this in the pro-Russia, pro-China pot or the other pot? Do we put this in the pro-democracy or anti-democracy pot? And I think all that we're seeing is actions that are to the benefit of China and Russia, where you have those two leaders popping champagne corks in their respective capitals.
Yes.
And just to kind of finish off today's somewhat ranty live stream, we have Musk and Russia again joining forces to swing an election. So Russia's bot army is flooding X with disinformation ahead of Germany's elections. As per Politico, the Kremlin-backed doppelganger operation is deploying AI-generated content, fake news sites and sleeper accounts to sway voters. Their targets undermining Ukraine and amplifying far-right AfD, now second in the polls and eroding trust in democracy. Moscow's playbook: clone media, spread lies, manipulate the narrative. And Elon Musk is happy to allow that to happen on his platform. In fact, he is one that has spoken twice now to the AfD and has also platformed their leader, Alice Weidel. Or is it Weidel? Is it I before? Anyway, I think it's Weidel, actually. So there you go. And the reunification of Germany has yet to happen. Look at this. Absolutely fascinating infographic there. The former GDR areas, so the Eastern Germany areas are AfD and West Germany is not AfD. And it's that simple. It's just absolutely incredible there. So the former GDR area is now dominated by extreme right-wing AfD, with the Old West overwhelmingly supporting the centre-right CDU, and all according to the polls now. Quite incredible that map there. And then another European, well, this is an opinion from Ireland, who is part of the Tochny team, Giorgia Meloni, who is actually pro-Ukrainian, but she is in a very right-wing party herself, in a very right-wing coalition with Matteo Salvini, who's anti-Ukraine, and his La Liga and Forza Italia, Berlusconi's party, although Berlusconi's passed away now. Giorgia Meloni is again copy-pasting Mussolini speeches about Italy's greatness, like it's some growing superpower. At the same time, Italy is plunging towards recession, and her government is an incompetent gang of fascists and buffoons. Italy's economy shows signs of a de facto recession, with industrial production struggling despite lower interest rates, and weak domestic demand and external pressures are weighing heavily on growth. But yeah, interesting that's the direction she's going in. What else do we have? Viktor Orban. So we're finishing with Viktor Orban. French TV channel France 2. Orban has been found to own an undeclared luxurious Austro-Hungarian era palace worth $45 million, trying to emulate his idol Putin. And in fact, there's a new documentary that's just come out by what's his name? I forget his name. A Hungarian guy has just done this documentary. It's been watched 1.5 million times already on Orban's massive wealth and his family's massive wealth. Well worth looking into. And when you hear, so this is Daniel Freund saying, if anything is ever going to destroy Europe, it will be corrupt autocrats like Viktor Orban. So Viktor Orban then says, the bureaucrats of Brussels have destroyed Europe. Because of Brussels, the European economy is slowly sinking. Because of Brussels, our money is being sent to Ukraine to a hopeless war. Because of Brussels, Europe has been flooded with migrants. Brussels has opened the gates, opened the borders to the invasion of migrants. George Soros announced 1 million migrants must be allowed into Europe every year. Hey presto, in the last 9 years, 9 million migrants have arrived in Europe. The migrant invasion of Europe, the population exchange is not a conspiracy theory, but the practice itself. It's time to look for a new conspiracy theories because all the old ones have come true. And that is like Viktor Orban going full on anti-EU, full on anti-Europe, while at the same time pocketing all that corrupt money to give himself palaces. His son is a billionaire, I think, and has no, basically, it's a complete kleptocracy. I think it's it's either the worst or the second most corrupt nation in the EU, Hungary, and yeah, that's autocracy for you. Anyway,
and certainly, given a lot of Transparency International sort of measures of institutional corruption, Hungary, on many accounts, performs far worse than Ukraine at this point of time. It has to be pointed out.
Yeah, really good point. And it's also worth remembering that Viktor Orban is Trump's best mate and idol. And you've got to be wondering whether again, it goes back to loving autocrats as unfortunately Donald Trump appears to do. He loves his autocrats. He loves Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban, Budapest has been the site of CPAC, the Conservative Conference, twice now. And I think Viktor Orban was welcomed with the red carpet into Mar-a-Lago. He is a big fan of the American right, and the American right are a big fan of Viktor Orban. It's like, this is the guy that you idolize, a corrupt autocrat. Like, what's happened to, people like Hutch? Like, what's happened to the Republicans of old, the conservatives of old, which is like true small c conservatism, as if you listen to Rory Stewart and people like that. It's like the belief in institutions, a faith in institutions and law and norms and so on and so forth, relying on, conserving those traditions. No, this kind of new MAGA republicanism, conservatism appears to be hell-bent on burning things to the ground whilst advocating for corruption and a lack of transparency and so on and so forth. These are troubling times that we live in.
But exceedingly so. Maybe for our next one, because we're jumping off now, maybe for our next one, we could get to look at apparently a documentary has been aired by the BBC, or is about to be aired by the BBC, made by a journalist who has illegally entered occupied Ukrainian territory, embedded himself with Russian forces, and appears to be echoing a lot of the propagandistic narratives, ones even that we saw in the widely debunked and vilified Russians at War film, which was the story last year. Sean Langan, I need to do a little bit of research on that, but maybe on our next live stream, we could cover off the penetration of our media sphere by Russian BS. That's as distracted we are with Trump and everything else,
worrying.
Russian offensive propaganda, information propaganda does not end. In fact, it's going to, if anything, scale up in the current chaos. And maybe good to chat about that next time.
Here's a guy who's talking about Shabolks. Pagny, probably butchered that. Viktor Orban's son-in-law doesn't buy real estate or develop hotels. He collects trophies. Watch his subtitled excerpt from The Dynasty. That's what it's called. That's the documentary you can watch to see how Budapest hotels and historic buildings ended up in Orban's family's hands. So he's gone on to he's talking a lot about this documentary at the moment and the ripples it's causing within Hungary. Now, before we go though, Jonathan, we have a few thanks to some of the very kind supporters of both the channels. We'll start with Julian Rossiter. Thanks, matey. Do you think that Trump is being manipulated by more nefarious actors, both foreign and domestic, in order to enact their agenda? That's a really great question. What do you think, Jonathan?
There is certainly, it exists on a number of levels. Yes, there is going to be concerted attempts to penetrate Trump's team with certain agendas. It's like lobbying on steroids. And let's face it, lobbying has been an intrinsic part of the US political system. It's a form of oligarchic control and manipulation. That's not new. That's not unique to Trump, but we see it on steroids. There are more billionaires in Trump's cabinet than any previous sort of administration.
13.
And it's many, many orders of magnitude more than Biden. But again, I mention that because, yes, there was clearly lobbying interests in Biden's circle and around Biden's circle. And there's a lot of complaints to be had about the corporate Democrats and even their lack of resistance right now that they're showing to what is this sort of administrative coup that Musk has mounted. But the scale of that oligarchic influence or the attempts to lobby are off the scale. And of course, more needs to be made of that. Within that, you will have both foreign and domestic influence. But the foreign influence exists on two things. One is the attempt to actually penetrate and change policy. The other one is to create the illusion that Trump has no independence. And Russia's very, very good at that. We think back to the Steele dossier, which is believed by some experts to have been a piece of Russian tradecraft. So they're very good at creating the illusion of control and manipulation. And think about how easy and relatively cheap that is, but the outsized sort of ability that Russia's been able to weaponize the information sphere. The Steele dossier, if it was a piece of tradecraft, is relatively cheap in terms of offensive capability, and yet it completely weaponized the political and media environment during Trump's first term. So we need to watch out for genuine influence, and we need to watch out for this creation of the appearance of influence.
And I think there are people like Steve Bannon who have these weird and wonderful views on, say, Ukraine and Russia. And if you're having him there, and then you get people like Paul Manafort in, and so on and so forth, then there are people who are influencing who will be doing so for nefarious reasons. You look at what happened with the guy that the FBI have just done over, who what was his name, who was found guilty of basically the whole Burisma thing of falsifying claims there. And so there are these nefarious entities and agents that are acting. Some of them will be doing it because they're just in that sphere of influence. People like Donald Trump Jr., he's just someone that's not clever enough to know what's going on and is easily influenced by others who can then influence maybe his father in some sort of way. So, there will be different levels of influence going on, but certainly there are bad faith actors involved, I think, in the administration. Johnny Nedregard, thank you very much. Hello, community. Lots of really great questions and comments that we haven't been able to look at. Finnish guy, still the best channel ever. Thanks for that. Just thanks again to Hutch, and I have to pass that on to Jonathan Fink. So thank you very much for that on his behalf. Mark Biscuit, as ever, total legend. Listen to your rant in part 1 today. I'm in full agreement and often one of the same thing. With Russia weakened now, do you both feel that Europe can assist Ukraine adequately on its own? This is a golden question. I actually do think they can, and we're starting to hear the rhetoric from Kaja Kallas is great in her position, present position, and I think Ursula von der Leyen is also equally strong. As someone said the other day, why is it the female leaders at the moment are the ones that are saying the correct and strongest things in support of Ukraine? I don't know if that's just a funny coincidence, but yeah, I think
I wonder about that. I wonder if it's because they've had to struggle, they've had to exhibit more of these leadership qualities to actually get to the top of the pile in their political systems. And that's just pure speculation, but it's worth looking into.
But yeah, I think so. Europe have got the right rhetoric. It's the difficulty with Europe is about unanimity of decisions, and when you've got people like Slovakia and Hungary in there as well, these things become difficult. But I think they should be able to, in terms of the GDP, collective GDP of Europe, plus Norway, plus UK. Whether they will, it remains to be seen. I think the rhetoric is there, and I think the strategic understanding is there. I think the intelligence, people at the top know what's going on. The difficulty is, again, going back to you exist on a 4-year cycle. And so you've got Germany at the moment where you've got half, like a third of the electorate are basically anti-Ukraine, kind of pro-Russia in a sense. And so therefore, it's like the government can recognize that we need to support Ukraine as much as possible. And in fact, you had a discussion between Scholz and Merz last night in this kind of duel on TV, and they both agreed that supporting Ukraine was a way forward. But then you are hamstrung somewhat by the fact that a lot of your population don't want that. And that's the control of the narrative. That's about media and disinformation and so on and so forth. So right around Europe, people are always, there's going to be the understanding that we need to support Ukraine and that we can support Ukraine, but also you need to be re-elected in 1, 2, 3 or 4 years time. And people are going to be asking, why have we put X billion dollars towards Ukraine and not towards our hospitals and our education? And so that is what is going to be the challenge for Europe, is they understand the need, but the practicality of supporting Ukraine is another thing.
And we're not hearing that sort of leadership messages from, many Western European countries. The sort of, the explanation of why these pain of the costs need to be borne because of the absolute threat. We're hearing a lot more rhetoric about the threat, but not, movement in terms of, fundamentally resisting it.
Financial Times had a really good article and graphs on the closeness to Moscow and the amount of aid being given to Ukraine. And as you get further to the west, i.e., when you get to through Italy, through to Spain and Portugal, very much below the curve. And obviously the Baltics and Poland and the Nordics are well up there. So really interesting stuff there. Kevin Force, thanks, by the way, Mark Biscuit, you're an absolute legend. And thanks for your lovely, I haven't replied to your email about that video from the field of Mars in Lviv at the military cemetery, where I got all rather emotional. And you sent me a lovely email, and I need to reply to you, Mark, and on a note. So thank you so much. Kevin Forst gifted 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Thanks, matey. Always a legend. Dan Smith, who came with us, Jonathan, on our trip, and he came with us all the way to Lviv and then had to leave us in Lviv. So Daniel, just saying hi. That's really kind of you. And he's also helped your channel as well.
It's very kind down there.
Jonathan,
buy me a coffee. Thank you so much.
He has spreading love from Bristol, Bristol with love on Silicon Curtain 2. Having 2 Jonathans, both with such clarity on geopolitics and keeping their eye on Russia and a fanatical right wing, is a great relief. Thanks for that, Daniel. Total legend. And this one's for you. This is Taiwanese dollars. 3,000 Taiwanese dollars. Kudos from Taiwan. This chilling winter has reinforced my belief that every supper is a struggle and life is certainly a war, with or without these barbarous dictators. So that's Gary Hunt on your channel.
That's fantastic. There. Thank you.
Really kind of you, Gary. Thank you. AJ Simo for mine. When the world is too dark, I need some light inside of me. Shane McGowan about alcohol. Interestingly, towards a nice bottle of something. JP, do you know what? I've not really drunk. I did have a beer actually watching the rugby the other day, but I felt all the worse for it. I can't wait to have a nice glass of wine and be able to taste it after I get over this illness. Ugh. Thanks, AJ. Really appreciate that. Thanks, Dan, again. Legend. Graham Baker. Thank you for your super sticker. Absolutely awesome. And also for yourself as well. So that first one was for you, JF.
No, it's brilliant.
Second
Thank
one
you, Graham.
for me. Thanks, matey. And some ATP Geopolitics memberships from Richard Bennett, always a great supporter. Reb Tyree as well, super kind, really kind, and some more there as well. So thanks, Reb. That's incredibly generous of you. And just finally, some really wonderful questions and comments that we didn't have time to go through. I wanted to discuss that. 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 And I also wanted to discuss that. And I also wanted to discuss that. But we never got to it.
We'll have to get together again Thursday, maybe, where we have a chance maybe to cover some of this stuff up. Thursday or Friday, let's see.
I'm just amazed you spent so long here, Jonathan. It was a long one, but my goodness, there's an awful lot going on at the moment, and it does require a little bit of unpicking. So thank you for allowing me to try and unpick your brain and allowing me to just splurge my vomit and geopolitical bile all over the screen.
Absolutely welcome. Huge pleasure. And I'm going to go and give my voice a little bit of a rest before recording another episode a little later.
Absolutely. Well, big love to you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all the very kind supporters of both channels and the wonderful live chat that you guys have furnished us with. It really is an absolute delight to be able to speak to you guys. And it's really nice to have such wonderful support. So thank you.
And if anyone's curious about that discussion we had with the Ukrainian philosopher, I think it's probably one of the most sort of concentrated videos I've done in 3 years. And it really captures why Russia constantly reverts to aggression, expansionism, and the sort of stuff that we see. So if you haven't sort of seen that video there with Volodymyr Yermolenko on the channel, it's available to view. I mean, it's really great background to anyone who wants to understand why Ukraine is resisting Russian attempts to conquer it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want to see where it is, go to Silicon Curtain and you'll find it there, Why Russia Attacks. It's a really great video and a wonderful question for myself at the end, of course. So that makes it all the better. No, it's really good. And I swapped details with him. So I should be myself interviewing him at some point in the near distant future. So look out for that one. But well worth going to see Jonathan's absolutely wonderful conversation with him.
That's fantastic, and a pleasure to have experienced all that with you and the gang who were with us.
Yeah, absolutely. It was wonderful. Really good. Well, look, I guess the last thing to say, my good friend, is Slava Ukraini.
Heroям slava, smert varagam.
Indeed. Double that, times two. Thanks, everyone. Take care, y'all. Stand on line, matey. And we'll speak soon. Toodle pips.
Cheers.